In just 6 minutes on an international flight, a black man was humiliated, asked to give up his seat, and treated like a nobody, until 14 armed officers boarded the plane and addressed him as Mr. President. Why was the leader of a nation treated with such disrespect? And what kind of silence made the whole world stop and bow their heads? Brussels, 4:40 a.m. The city lay in a hush, suspended between night and morning, in that strange twilight where everything is awake but nothing is truly alive. Inside the terminal, fluorescent lights cast a sickly, bluish pall over the floors, washing out color and warmth. Their reflections shimmered faintly on the polished tiles, giving the illusion of water underfoot. The air smelled unmistakably of airports, a sterile blend of metal, worn plastic, and coffee that had been brewed hours too early. Cold winds slipped through the gaps of the sliding doors every time someone passed, bringing with it a faint whiff of jet fuel and the loneliness only airports seemed to carry. Sounds were muted, footsteps softened, conversations hushed, announcements few and far between. The only consistent noise was the low hum of luggage wheels rolling steadily across stone like a clock ticking down towards something no one could see. Into that quiet entered a man, unhurried, unremarkable, and completely alone. He walked as though he'd done this 1,000 times before, with the steady pace of someone who had long accepted that airports do not remember faces. His clothes were plain, functional, worn in, a gray coat frayed around the collar and elbows, sneakers that once were white but had faded to a dull beige, and a canvas backpack slung low over his shoulder. He didn't check the monitors. He didn't look around for signs. There was no companion beside him, no phone in his hand, no air of business or leisure. Just presence, calm, steady, and invisible. He passed through the first security checkpoint without attracting so much as a glance. No one looked at him twice. No one even paused. Near a coffee counter, a small group of businessmen were already deep into their morning routine, laughing too loudly in the otherwise silent space. Their tailored suits stood in contrast to the emptiness around them, their expensive watches catching the dull light every time they gestured animatedly. One of them, a man in his 50s with a red scarf tucked neatly into his coat, spoke about recent acquisitions in Africa with a gleam of satisfaction in his voice. They had, he said, secured a mining contract in Burkina Faso. A gold deal we got for next to nothing. The others chuckled. Their tone wasn't cruel, but it was clear. The people they spoke of were far away, faceless, and silent. Locals, one said, are easier to handle than regulations. Another compared them to tools, necessary but replaceable. The man in the gray coat passed by them unnoticed, even when one of the businessmen nearly collided with him while adjusting his earpiece. For the briefest of seconds, the two stood face to face, but the businessman's eyes didn't settle. He looked through the man, not at him, as if the space he occupied was more relevant than the person himself. No apology came, no acknowledgement, not even the instinctive mumble of excuse people give when brushing past a stranger. The man didn't react. His face remained still, his eyes forward, his steps unchanged. It wasn't pride, it was familiarity, the ease of someone who had been overlooked too many times to expect otherwise. He kept walking, steady and silent, like a shadow drawn across a wall. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have sensed something, a depth in his stillness, a weight in his quiet. But no one watched closely. A young security officer stood off to the side, absorbed in his phone. His badge was crooked and his shoelace untied, but he was smiling, typing something on a messaging app, maybe sharing a meme. When a white woman walked past, he looked up immediately, offering a courteous nod and a warm smile, even though she didn't return it. When the man in the gray coat passed by a few seconds later, the officer glanced up briefly, gave a blink of disinterest, then turned back to his screen. Not because he meant disrespect, just because in his mind there was nothing to see. Just a traveler, another face, another coat, another bag. That moment, that unconscious sorting of people into seen and not seen, passed without weight. But it was one of 1,000 similar moments that, strung together, tell a very specific story. The man eventually stopped by a row of empty seats near the window, where the first blue hues of morning bled into the edges of the sky beyond the tarmac. He set his bag on the floor, sat down with his back straight, and folded his hands in his lap. He didn't stretch. He didn't sigh. He didn't give any of the usual signs of weariness. In his hand was a scratched, older model smartphone, a device well used, its corners worn from years of handling. He unlocked it, thumb gliding with practiced familiarity, and opened his inbox. Subject lines appeared in quick succession, all tied to a recent summit: government communications, policy briefs, updates from UN energy committees. He opened one labeled, Gold Rights in Sahel, Final Notes and UN Delegation Summary. As he read, his eyes remained still, absorbing every line. Around him, no one noticed. No one suspected that this man, quiet and seemingly unremarkable, was reviewing confidential diplomatic reports just hours before stepping into his country's parliament. Passengers trickled past, a family juggling boarding passes and backpacks, a flight crew walking with the crisp purpose of schedule-bound lives, a Belgian grandmother anxiously speaking into her phone, her voice trembling with worry about a delayed connection. None of them glanced in his direction. If they had, they'd have seen a man neither anxious nor distracted, but deeply present. There was something precise in his stillness. Not the forced patience of someone trying to stay calm, but the collected air of someone who had long mastered the art of waiting without losing himself. Farther down the hall, an older Arab man looked up from his newspaper and stared for a moment, brow furrowed. But after a beat, he shook his head as if dismissing the thought, lowered his eyes again, and turned the page. The man in the gray coat remained where he was, unmoving. A breeze from the ventilation system stirred the collar of his coat, revealing a worn leather watch on his wrist. It was not expensive, the kind of watch someone wears not for style or statement, but out of habit, memory, or practicality. It told time. That was all. He adjusted it slightly, then leaned down to retrieve something from his bag. As he did, the side of the backpack came into view. Faded canvas, stitched seams barely holding. On its lower corner, a few letters were still legible. RAS. The rest of the lettering had been rubbed away, torn or worn down through years of use. No one paid attention to it. No one noticed. But had they looked closely, they might have realized those were the final letters of an official insignia. Burkina Faso. State diplomacy. Inside that bag, along with a change of clothes and a water bottle, were documents from a multinational summit, briefing notes from ministers of energy, and a carefully crafted draft of a national address that would be delivered before his country's legislative body later that day. The man was not lost. He was not unimportant. He was not invisible by accident. His anonymity was a shield, one that years of experience had taught him to wear like a second skin. He had learned the quiet power of not being expected, the advantage of not being announced. He knew that people look right past what they don't expect to matter, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one no one bothers to notice. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need a sign around his neck or a flag at his feet. His presence wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. And before the morning was done, the people who had ignored him, who had looked through him, spoken over him, judged him without knowing, would be forced to reckon with the weight of their mistake. Because silence, when worn by the right person, is not weakness. It is strategy. And this man, the man with the frayed coat, the tired shoes, and the torn canvas bag, was not just any traveler waiting for a flight. He was the president of a nation, and he had come to remind the world that dignity doesn't require permission. It simply waits until it is time to be seen. The automatic glass door on the left side of the terminal slid open once again, not for another tired traveler dragging a suitcase or a family shuffling forward with strollers and boarding passes clutched tight, but for a gust of cold air that seemed to carry something else entirely: tension. The breeze swept through the waiting hall like a silent alarm, bringing with it the unmistakable presence of someone who walked not with footsteps, but with the force of a storm. Ibrahim remained by the window, exactly as he had been, perfectly still, eyes fixed beyond the pane toward the runway where the silver wings of aircraft cut the early light like blades through a fading dream. He didn't turn his head. He didn't shift in his seat, but the atmosphere around him changed. You could feel it, the subtle disruption in a room when someone enters, convinced the world owes them its full attention. The man who had just walked in wore a deep navy suit tailored so precisely it moved like skin, the fabric still sharp from the press. His white shirt was flawlessly crisp, and his wine-colored tie looked as though it had been chosen by a personal stylist rather than pulled from a drawer. His shoes gleamed black and hard under the airport lights, polished to the point of reflection. In one hand he held a phone pressed firmly against his ear. In the other, a boarding mouse raised like a banner or a threat. His voice shattered the quiet like glass, loud, clipped, forceful. "I have a first-class ticket and a legal agreement signed with three African governments. You're telling me there's no seat left for me? Are you insane?" The words sliced the air cleanly and heads turned, some startled, others irritated, but all aware now that someone had arrived who expected to be noticed. Behind the check-in counter, young staff members exchanged panicked glances and typed quickly, fingers hitting keys with the urgency of a sinking ship. One of them, a man barely out of college, tried to maintain composure as he responded, "Sir, we sincerely apologize. You arrived after final boarding for business class, and the seats have been filled. We're trying to—" But the man cut him off mid-sentence as if the explanation itself were an insult. "I am Gaspar Leroy, CEO of Leroy Energy. I am a strategic partner of Burkina Faso. Who here thought I could be relegated to economy?" Each word landed like a gavel strike, heavy and final. Behind him, a line of passengers instinctively took a half-step back, not out of fear, but from the sheer force of his self-assuredness. Gaspar wasn't negotiating, he was demanding, and everyone understood. Demands like his usually win. It was only a matter of time. Still, Ibrahim remained seated. He had not flinched, not even when Leroy's voice first pierced the waiting hall. The only change was the faint tilt of his head to the left, a subtle movement that suggested he was listening, though not reacting. On his phone, a new update had arrived. It was the final version of the speech he would deliver before his country's parliament upon landing. His eyes moved slowly down the lines of text until he reached a section titled "Foreign Interest in Resource Extraction." There he paused, then, without expression, he underlined one sentence 3 times. "Opaque partnerships built on profit, not trust." His thumb hovered above the screen for a moment longer, and his brows narrowed ever so slightly. At the check-in counter, tension thickened. One staff member reached for the radio clipped to his collar and spoke in hurried French. Less than 2 minutes later, a calm but firm voice responded in his earpiece. "Call lead attendant Brigitte to board. Resolve quietly. Avoid media visibility." The message carried the weight of experience. They had done this before. Avoid escalation. Keep it clean. Keep it off record. From the mouth of the jet bridge, the sound of steady footsteps echoed, and then she appeared. Brigitte Lemaitre, tall, poised, immaculate. Her uniform was perfectly fitted, not a crease out of place. A silk scarf folded in an old Parisian knot hugged her neck. Her lipstick, a sharp, unforgiving red, matched neither the season nor the mood, but commanded the space like a warning. She didn't walk fast, but her every step had purpose, as if the ground beneath her was compelled to yield. She said nothing as she approached the aircraft, her eyes locked ahead with surgical focus. She didn't need a manifest. She didn't ask for a name. She simply met the gaze of the agent who had called her. A single glance that said, "Do what must be done, but do it elegantly." She stepped into the cabin of business class with the air of someone who had rebalanced dozens of seating charts mid-flight and had never once questioned who belonged where. Passengers stirred, some closing laptops, others sipping champagne, a few tightening their seatbelts in anticipation. But in seat 2A, by the window, something didn't fit the usual rhythm. A man in a gray fabric coat, with shoes that hadn't been polished in weeks, sat quietly. His canvas bag rested neatly at his feet. There was nothing disorderly about him, nothing improper. But to Brigitte, there was something off, something that didn't match the crystal glassware, the folded napkins shaped like swans, the curated elegance of first class. She didn't ask for identification. didn't double-check the seat assignment. She didn't know the man's name and didn't need to. Her eyes told her everything she needed to believe. In her world, people like this didn't sit in 2A, not unless they were invited, not unless someone vouched for them. She walked to his seat and offered a slim, practiced smile, the kind that means nothing at all. "Sir, due to a scheduling issue, we need to rearrange some seating. Would you mind moving to the economy cabin for the flight?" Her French accent lingered gently at the edges of her words, like a ribbon around a knife. The smile said apology, the tone said expectation, and the eyes said get up. Ibrahim looked up slowly. The morning sun poured in from the window, catching in his eyes, illuminating his features in that delicate light that makes even sorrow look beautiful. For a fleeting second, he looked like any man being told he didn't belong. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a boarding pass. Stiff, printed, unmistakably official. Horizon France Air, Seat 2A, Priority Boarding. He held it up with 2 fingers, calm and silent. No words, just fact. Brigitte looked at the pass, 1 second, maybe less. Then she looked back at his face. Her expression didn't change. No apology followed. No sudden recognition. Only a small nod, a gesture of reluctant acceptance. And she turned to leave. But the way she returned the ticket to his hand, a little too forcefully, a little too dismissively, was enough to drop the cabin temperature by a few degrees. In row 3, an older woman who had watched the entire exchange narrowed her eyes. A younger flight attendant nearby paused, seemed ready to speak, then changed her mind and turned away. Ibrahim bowed his head, not out of shame, but out of a desire to let the moment pass without war. But war has many forms, and the moment had already started its descent into something far larger. What had just happened was not a misunderstanding. It was recognition denied, power tested, and not even the people involved fully understood what they had just done. They had tried to erase a man who had built his life, ensuring he could never be erased again. They had questioned the presence of a head of state, not because of his actions, not because of protocol, but because he simply didn't look like he should belong. And in doing so, they had set into motion a series of consequences that no boarding pass could reverse. At that moment, no one in the business class cabin realized they were sitting at the center of a cultural fault line, one that was quietly shifting beneath their feet. Everything seemed calm, composed, even luxurious, but something had changed. It was invisible but unmistakable, like static electricity gathering just before lightning strikes. Brigitte stood in front of seat 2A, wearing the kind of perfectly practiced smile that had been honed over thousands of flights. But this time, behind the professionalism, there was no warmth. What sat behind that smile was not service, but judgment. And that judgment had already been made long before she stepped foot into the cabin. Her words carried no command, yet offered no real choice either. "Sir, due to a scheduling issue, we need to rearrange some seating. Would you mind moving to the economy cabin for the flight?" The tone was light, polite on the surface, but every word was laced with an assumption that this man with his worn coat, his dull shoes, and his quiet stillness couldn't possibly be someone who belonged here. There was no apology, no clear explanation, and most importantly, no acknowledgement that he deserved the seat he was in. Ibrahim looked up. His eyes didn't show anger or surprise, only clarity. The kind of quiet awareness that comes from hearing these kinds of sentences your entire life, just in different rooms. Sometimes it came at the visa desk, sometimes at the customs gate, sometimes at formal dinners where he wasn't greeted until he introduced himself. He didn't need to ask why. He already knew how they do things. And in moments like this, the response didn't require volume. It required presence. Slowly, without urgency, Ibrahim reached into the pocket of his coat. His movements were deliberate, not defensive. He moved like a man retrieving something of value, not to prove anything, but to make something clear. He pulled out a boarding pass, printed, laminated, clearly marked. It had a QR code in bold letters that read, Seat 2A, Business Priority, Firm. Say how saw you front to Ibrahim said nothing. He simply held out the ticket toward Brigitte, a silent gesture that communicated what words didn't need to. I am here, I am legitimate, I have been acknowledged. But it wasn't the ticket. It was how he offered it and how she looked at it that defined the humiliation. Bridget glanced down for exactly 1 second. Her eyes showed no recognition, only coldness. There was no surprise, no discomfort, not even the bare minimum of an apology, something any professional flight attendant is trained to offer when they have made a mistake. She barely looked at it before lightly pushing it back toward him, a gesture so reflexive it bordered on dismissive, like the ticket was something she didn't want to hold any longer than necessary. Then came the nod, small, stiff, almost rude, before she turned on her heel and walked away. When someone is denied their rightful place in a direct way, they might argue, raise their voice, demand justice, but when they're denied in silence, not by a statement, but by the refusal to acknowledge the lack of a thank you, the absence of recognition, that kind of denial lingers. It burrows. It doesn't bruise the skin. It bruises something deeper. From the next row, a woman in a blazer briefly lifted her eyes from her book, catching the last part of the exchange, then quickly looked back down. She had seen but wasn't sure what to do with what she saw. Another flight attendant witnessed her colleague's actions and hesitated, wanting to speak but remained quiet. No one said anything. Not a word. Only Ibrahim remained. He looked at the boarding pass in his hand, then folded it neatly, precisely, and tucked it back into his coat pocket. His fingers trembled just slightly, not from anger, but from a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It came from memory, from the hundreds of moments like this one he had endured throughout his life, moments where his right to exist in a space, no matter how legitimate, no matter how clearly documented, was quietly erased simply because he didn't look like the kind of person they expected to see in a business class seat. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was always there. Someone like you doesn't belong with a ticket like this. They didn't need to say it. Their actions said it for them. Every gesture, every glance, every second of silence formed a language of its own. A language Ibrahim knew by heart, even if he'd never taught it to anyone else. And the irony of it all was this: everyone in that cabin believed they were simply preserving order. They believed they were upholding some silent logic of the world. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't begin to imagine, was that the very man they were trying to erase from the picture was the one who had the power to redraw the entire frame. And they had just a few hours left before the picture changed forever. The business class cabin was beginning to settle, the soft click of the closing aircraft doors signaling something more final than just departure. It was the quiet seal on a decision, one no one spoke of, but everyone felt. Passengers began to buckle their seatbelts, retrieve their books, plug in their headphones. No one looked at each other for too long. There was an unspoken pact hovering in the air. If we stay silent, we stay safe. And yet, something was undeniably wrong. Not loud, not explosive, but slow, seeping, like pressure building behind a wall. And then, as if reacting to a creeping sense of losing control, Bridget returned to the cabin. But this time the practiced smile was gone from her face. She stood still in the aisle for a moment, eyes sweeping across the rows as though scanning for a suitable candidate. Gaspar Leroy's seat still needed to be readied. She couldn't confront the man in seat 2A again, not now, not after that. But she could still do something else. Find someone easier to displace, someone more replaceable, someone who resembled Ibrahim closely enough that the logic could slip by unquestioned. It was a kind of human substitution, not based on name, not on seat number, but bone and skin tone. If she couldn't remove the problem, she could still remove the version of it. Her eyes landed on seats 4D and 5A. Both passengers were black. One was a young businessman, dressed in a white shirt and tie, typing rapidly on a laptop. The other, a middle-aged man in a brown coat with a fabric watch band, sat quietly looking out the window. Neither man had caused a stir. Neither had drawn attention. But that didn't matter. They fit the silent profile of someone easier to move. Alone, quiet, unaccompanied. And most crucially, they looked like another version of the man who had refused to leave seat 2A. Bridget walked to the first man. Her voice was low, smooth, and disturbingly certain. We need to adjust the seating for priority reorganization. Would you be willing to move to economy class? The man looked up, clearly confused. I'm sorry, I booked business class from the start. Is there a mistake? Bridget tilted her head, offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. No mistake, sir. We apologize, but we'd appreciate your cooperation. No one stepped in. No one checked his ticket. After a pause, the man closed his laptop, unfastened his seatbelt, stood up, bowed slightly, and walked out without another word. His seat was now empty, not because of policy, because of quiet removal, done without resistance. She moved to the second man. This time he said nothing. Maybe he'd overheard. Maybe he just knew. He looked at Bridget for 3 seconds, then nodded silently. He picked up his bag, bowed slightly, and stepped into the aisle like a man who had always understood that even paid for dignity could be revoked at a moment's notice. And at that moment, if there had been a spectator watching, truly watching, they might have asked, why didn't anyone object? Why didn't anyone say a word in defense? But that was the cruelty of it. The silence was the system. It turned injustice into routine, simply by letting it happen in plain view, without interference. In under 5 minutes, both seats were cleared and wiped down. Leroy stepped in from the front, guided by a different attendant. In his hand was a glass of champagne. He smiled as he approached. His seat was waiting. And then, Bridget returned again, this time back to 2A, where Ibrahim still sat, head slightly tilted to the right, eyes fixed on the wall-glowing screen of his phone. He didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just stood there, arms folded, feet firmly planted, radiating a quiet challenge. Her posture said everything. I can still make you leave, you know it, and I'm giving you one last chance to surrender. The cabin wasn't loud, but the silence inside was thick and uneasy, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that buzzed just beneath the skin. A woman in seat 3B pressed her fingers into her thigh, nails digging into her pants. Behind the curtain near the galley, a junior flight attendant stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. And then Ibrahim stood. Not in haste, not in hesitation. He moved with purpose, with weight. He turned to face Bridget, eye to eye. There was no anger in his stance, no aggression in his posture, but there was power, a kind of stillness that made others go still too. He looked directly at her, gaze unwavering, not piercing with rage, but with something far more difficult to face, absolute clarity. As if he could see past her uniform, past her lipstick, past the carefully taught poise, and into the small, fragile heart of arrogance itself. And then he spoke. Not loudly, but deliberately, each word landing like the strike of a gavel on the floor of truth. To judge someone by their skin is to proudly declare your own ignorance. No one laughed, no one clapped, but something broke in the air, something no polite apology would ever be able to repair. Outside the window, the sky shifted from pale blue to a soft orange glow as Horizon Flight 872 began its descent. Below, the landscape of Burkina Faso unfolded like a breathing map, cracked fields stretching for miles, corrugated metal roofs gleaming under the rising sun, and clusters of low trees scattered like islands in a dusty sea. The sun was rising, and in some unspoken way, it felt as though it was preparing the stage for a moment no one on this plane would ever forget. Ibrahim remained seated in 2A, eyes still fixed on the world outside. He hadn't spoken since the sentence that had silenced the entire cabin. He didn't look for anyone's gaze. He didn't reach for his phone. He just sat, as if counting each beat of the aircraft's descent, each passing minute, bringing him closer to the end of a story whose final chapter had been written long ago, long before any of them boarded this flight. Gaspard Leroy now sat comfortably in the seat that had been cleared for him, one leg crossed over the other like a man who had just outmaneuvered his opponent in a chess match. In his hand, a champagne glass twirled slowly, as if even the bubbles knew he was someone important. When he glanced out the window, he noticed the convoy, black SUVs already parked along the edge of the runway, their polished frames gleaming in the morning light. Dozens of officers in dark uniforms stood at attention in 2 perfect rows, their posture sharp, their focus unshaken. Leroy smiled. "Looks like they're here for me," he whispered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, and held his chin a bit higher. His expression was that of a prince about to descend the steps of his private palace. All that was missing was a red carpet. The moment the plane's wheels touched the runway, the cabin filled with the sound of fate landing. The deep thrum of deceleration roared through the cabin, the aircraft tilting slightly, then slowing to a halt on a runway bathed in golden sunlight and lined with black vehicles like a royal procession. But something strange happened. The plane didn't taxi to the gate. Instead, a specialized stair vehicle pulled up alongside the aircraft, followed by a group of officers in full black uniform, stepping aboard with quiet authority. Their movements were calm, unhurried, and unmistakably deliberate. No one spoke. Every passenger turned their eyes toward the front of the cabin where the officers were boarding. Something felt off. The lead flight attendant stepped aside without being asked, giving way like a curtain drawn back before a stage. Sunlight poured in from the open door, catching the nameplate on the chest of the man at the front. Colonel Idrissa, commander of presidential security. Colonel Idrissa did not look left or right. He marched straight down the center aisle, passing row after row of hushed passengers until he stopped directly in front of seat 2A. There he paused, not just to breathe, but to mark the moment. He squared his shoulders, clicked his heels with military precision, raised his hand in a formal salute, and his voice rang out like a drum beat that shattered the silence. "Mr. President, welcome home." Everything broke at once. 1 second, two, then a third, and still no one spoke. Somewhere behind, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the cabin floor. Brigitte froze mid-step, the passenger manifest falling from her fingers and landing soundlessly beside her shoes. Gaspard Leroy jerked upright in his seat as if struck, mouth parted to speak, but no sound came. His voice, so loud before, had vanished. The entire business-class cabin seemed to collapse inward, heavy with the weight of realization. Those who had once glanced at Ibrahim with suspicion, dismissal, or indifference now found they could not look at him at all. They stared at their laps, their phones, or into nothing. No one had to tell them to look away, because true power doesn't need to raise its voice. It simply needs to be seen. And the moment it is, those who once stood taller will lower their gaze without being asked. Ibrahim rose slowly, fastening the top button of his coat. He turned and nodded to Colonel Idrissa, returning the salute not with grandeur, but with dignity. He said nothing. He didn't scold. He didn't glare. But his silence was louder than any speech. His presence alone was now undeniable. The officers immediately parted into two lines, forming a clear path down the aisle. And just before Ibrahim stepped off the plane, something happened that no one had orchestrated, but everyone instinctively followed. No names were called. No orders were given. Yet almost everyone in the cabin, as if guided by an ancient truth, tilted their heads slightly in a quiet bow. Not out of fear, but because they had no other choice. The truth had arrived, and they had no defense left but recognition. They had misjudged him, and they knew it. Brigitte stood motionless near the aircraft door, her face pale, as if the makeup she wore with such precision had been wiped clean by shame. She didn't know what to do. The passenger manifest still lay on the floor where she dropped it moments earlier. She didn't bend to pick it up. Her hands no longer seemed to respond. And then, as the officers began to exit the cabin, the last among them stepped quietly toward her and Gaspard Leroy, extending a polite but firm invitation to leave the plane. There were no handcuffs, no raised voices, but there was also no choice. Leroy walked ahead, each step seeming to weigh twice as much as it should. The smugness was gone. The champagne glass was gone. Even his tie had come undone slightly. He descended the steps like a man who had just watched an entire chapter of his career collapse in silence, even though no one had officially told him that the contract was canceled. Brigitte followed behind like a fading shadow. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. She no longer resembled the woman who once controlled everything with red lipstick and stern stares. Now she looked like a schoolgirl summoned to the principal's office, not because of something obvious, but because she'd realized far too late that she was wrong. On the runway, the press had begun to gather just beyond the security barricades. Cameras were raised. Voices called out. Someone shouted Ibrahim's name. A French reporter managed to slip through a gap and yelled loud enough to be heard. "Mr. President, do you plan to press charges against these two?" Ibrahim paused for half a second. He didn't turn around, just tilted his head slightly, enough for his voice to carry into the waiting microphones. "I don't want them punished. I want them to learn to see people with human eyes." There was nothing more to say, because that act of grace from a man who had been stripped of dignity on his own flight home was already the heaviest judgment either of them would ever carry. Within 24 hours of landing, the moment Colonel Idrissa saluted at Seat 2A and called out "Mr. President" had gone viral. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag #RespectAfrica soared to #1 overnight. A user with over 1 million followers posted, "He was in 2A, and you treated him like baggage." The video captured it all. Gaspar Leroy's face drained of color, Brigitte's frozen stare as she was escorted off the plane, and most strikingly, Ibrahim's calm, controlled composure as he stood up and walked away without a word or a wave. Under immense public pressure, Horizon France Air issued a formal apology, pledging to overhaul its respect and diversity training program. But the post was instantly flooded with tens of thousands of sarcastic replies. "You should have taught that before humiliating a head of state." Leroy Energy released a statement saying it was temporarily suspending commercial operations in Burkina Faso pending internal review. And just days later, the mining contract was revoked, without a single public comment from the Burkinabe government. They didn't need to explain. Everyone understood. As for Ibrahim, he granted no interviews, held no press conference, gave no televised speeches to restore his honor. The next morning, he appeared at a university in Ouagadougou, speaking with students about sustainable energy transition. He drank his usual black coffee, no sugar. His schedule remained full. Not a single minute was spared for the media frenzy erupting outside, perhaps because he knew everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, through his presence, through his ease, through silence. And when people asked, what made the business class bow their heads that day? The answer was not that he was the president, it was that he was a man who never needed to prove who he was. Because in the end, it was his silence that made everyone else take a hard look at themselves. If this touched your heart, even just a little, we ask for only one thing. Don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more real, soul-stirring stories that remind us of the power of compassion, dignity, and silent courage. And if you believe the world needs more leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, leave a comment below with just one word: hope. Let's flood the world with it. Disclaimer: this video is a transformative, creative retelling inspired by real humanitarian values and public leadership. It is intended for educational and emotional engagement under the principles of fair use. We do not claim official affiliation with any government figure or entity. All visual/audio materials used are edited and repurposed for commentary, inspiration, and social reflection.